Thank you to everybody for joining us online. You are here to access our great minds of the Missoula County Department of Ecology and Extension. The advantage of doing this live is that you guys get to ask questions. So what we're going to do is ask that you stay muted with videos off just for general recording quality throughout the presentation. But you can ask questions about your property and any of the concepts that you learned today through the chat box. So I'll be keeping track of questions through the chat box and saving them for the last slide of each case study. So we have 5 case studies that we're going through today, all in Western Montana. We're going to be highlighting specific noxious weeds in each, looking at some common themes and topics. So please put your questions in the chat box, and be patient. We'll answer those questions at the end of each case study because most likely we'll answer your question during the discussion. Okay, I have with me Stephanie Rogie. Stephanie works just down the hallway from me. She is the education coordinator at the Department of Ecology and Extension, and right alongside Lane Van Lincoln. I hope I'm saying that right, Lane. I've never had to say your last name out loud before, so I hope
It's
that's
Vaughn Lincoln, but you're close.
okay. Thanks. He's the Integrated Pest Management Coordinator, also for the Missoula County Department of Ecology and Extension. And I'm Natalie Sullivan. I'm the MSU Extension Agent for Ag and Livestock. Learning right along with you guys. I've just been in this position for a little over a year and constantly bringing bundles of grasses and weeds to these folks. But we've coordinated today to share with you some examples, give you some case studies of properties that are very similar to yours right here in Western Montana. So I'm going to get us started and then keep checking the admittance box there. We really have 3 major takeaways for you, and I'll be addressing the first one for each case study. We'll be exploring common themes that are causing those weeds to be introduced onto your property and why they are prospering. You'll definitely you'll start noticing some common themes as we go through each case study, and those are the major takeaways today. Your second major takeaway, Stephanie will be addressing identification. And if everybody could keep their videos off and muted, that would be fabulous. Our second major takeaway is to identify the most common noxious weeds in Western Montana and know them from the nuisance weeds. So Stephanie is going to have you pulling up some online PDFs. So if you have the opportunity, bring out your phone or pull up your web browser and be ready to punch in some things. We're actively going to be going through some of our weed identification sheets that also include how to control them. They're super, super well done, really nice, concise, great resources for you. Our third major takeaway, Elaine will be addressing how do we get rid of this stuff, or maybe how do we tolerate it? How do we live with it? Lane is our resident expert here on killing weeds. So if you have questions about specific herbicides, we'll be asking Lane about that. And because I like everything in threes and a number 4 takeaway didn't seem right to me, I'm calling it the bonus takeaway. Know what resources could benefit you from our office, the Missoula County Department of Ecology and Extension. And there'll be a long list of those things at the very end of the presentation. If you can't stay with us till the end, don't worry. This is being recorded and will be made available on our websites, which is missoulaeduplace.org. We'll have it on YouTube. There'll be a link to the recording so you can go back, maybe, find those QR codes again, etc. All right, so last minute housekeeping. If you are doing this on desktop, have your phone ready to scan these QR codes. I would suggest taking some notes. And again, one more time, please leave your audio and video off for the quality of the recording for everyone. And find the chat box. If you've just joined us, we'll be taking questions from the chat box at the end of each of the 5 case studies. All right. Stephanie, Lane, you ready? We've been working on this for months. Let's do this. All right. Case study number 1 is just down Mullen Road. I love this example. I love starting with this example because it's such a typical horse property. This is 5 acres. They have 3 horses on this property and a thistle problem. I think most of us can relate to that with horse pastures. It is the most annoying weed on my property. We also know it as Canada or creeping thistle, but it is a different species from bull thistle, which is the picture at the top. Again, that's bull thistle, and then down below is a picture of Canada or creeping thistle. Um, on this property, so I went and visited the owner, took some of these pictures, uh, dove into the storyline, which I'll be sharing with you. They have not used any herbicides in the last couple years, but did decide to use a product called Corteva Stinger early this spring, specifically for the Canada thistle. And Lane will answer any questions you have about that. It is an irrigated property, which is really, really important. That's one of the first questions that we will ask you if you bring us a situation about your land management. We'll ask, is it irrigated land or dry land? And because it makes an absolute massive difference on how aggressive the weeds will be, how much control you have, and ultimately in your um, solutions to those weed problems. And I think it's really important. Another really important question that we ask of every landowner when we do site visits or take phone calls is really dig into the specifics of your goals. We all have very different priorities on our property, and that is immensely important to how we might prioritize these solutions. And you'll see that some pretty dramatic differences in the pasture and land management goals of each case study. In this situation, again, very typical. She wanted to mitigate weeds because they're not very good to look. They're not very nice to look at, right? They limit grass production. So she was hoping to get more grass per acre. And of course, we're all busy. So we all want to save time and labor and not have to, be out there pulling or spraying weeds every day of the week. So for each property, I'll give you just an overview. If you're like me, I'm very, very visual and I love to just get oriented here. This back pasture is, about half of the property, so probably about 2.5 acres. There's some side pastures here. The one on the lower right is being used as a chicken pasture now, and the one on the left is a little more productive. It doesn't get grazed typically as much as these back corners. You'll see in some of these pictures that these back corners are not producing very well. And these are the places where the horses come back time and time and time again. So what I've done to orient us here, and here's your first QR code. Hopefully you guys can all see that okay. What we're going to do for the first 3 case studies is we're going to talk about how much forage is there and how many potential grazing hours do you have. And this is a really important exercise to shift your perspective, give you a basic understanding of what overgrazing is and what the right amount of grazing is for each property. And this is a calculation that I do with many and many of my site visits onto horse properties, or if you're grazing cattle, sheep, goats, what have you. It's nice to take inventory, see how much grass do you have in the bank, so to speak, and then how are you going to allocate out those grazing hours. So I'll go through this quite in depth with you the first time, and then we'll speed up as we go through each case study. In this situation, there are about 3.5 acres of pasture for 3 horses. Okay. Currently, the owner is allowing 4 hours of grazing per day. This was, I think I was there in early May. a really important bit of this that's really difficult to estimate without somebody who's done this a lot is to estimate how much grass is there. And I would assume if to be safe, I've been very conservative in estimating how much tonnage is out there. There's a lot of good ground cover, as you can see in this pasture. There is a lot of grass, but the grass is not very tall or thick. It's just kind of wimpy, sad grass. So I would assume there's maybe a ton per acre available for the year. Okay. And we'll compare that to the second case study where there's like 3 ton per acre. It's a big difference. So horses will consume, well, 3 horses will consume about 3,555 pounds of grass per year. Okay, sorry, per month. And we're using a calculation called AUMs or animal unit months. It's something that I've taken, it's a very scientific calculation set out by MSU Extension range program. And I've used those numbers, that very standardized number, and adapted it to horses. Okay, adapted it to horse grazing and this is a sheet. This is a grazing calculator worksheet that you can download from our pasture evaluation program website. Again, the QR code is there. But these horses will be consuming almost 120 pounds of grass per day. So that means she has 1,011 grazing hours in the bank. Okay. In order to not overgraze this pasture, not put so much pressure on the desirable grasses that we then allow the weeds to come in. Okay. In order to not overgraze this pasture, she's got about 1,000 grazing hours for 3 horses. Okay. That's with 3 horses grazing. If the owner continues to graze 4 hours per day, that is sustainable for 253 days or nearly 8 months. Okay. That means that this also assumes that there's some sort of rotational grazing and the horses are not going back to the same places over and over and over again. So again, I tried to be really conservative with the grass in the bank calculation, but again, very, very typical horse property. If these horses were out there, 9 months out of the year, would the pasture be ruined? Probably not. But if we start doing 9 months out of the year, year after year after year after year, that's where we get real deterioration and introduction of weeds and infestations that grow and grow and grow. Okay. But if she grazed 8 hours per day, okay, which a lot of us do, we like, oh, spring grass is gone. We're just going to throw them out for most of the day while we're out at work. If she does that, then she's only got 126 days of forage available or 4.1 months. Okay. So I can answer more that later on, but we're going to be doing this exercise over and over again. A really common theme that I want to bring up right away is timing of grazing. And this is extremely important, a very, very common mistake that I see on horse property. So I wanted to address it early because we're going to see this as a common theme. So the picture on the right is this chicken pasture that has not been grazed at all in the month of May. And you can just see how much more growth and ground cover, shade for the plants. This grass in the picture on the right will be competitive against the undesirable species of weeds. Whereas the back pasture that gets a lot more great, that has been grazed in this really critical spring growth time, this has half or even a third of the production potential for the year that the pasture on the right will. It can be a huge difference. The pasture on right, you could easily double to 2 tons per acre for the year rather than pasture on the left, which you might only have 1 ton of grass per year. Tripping myself up. 1 ton of grass per acre per year for the pasture on the left because of when you graze this pasture. And this is summarized in a sheet also available on the Pasture Evaluation Program website. You can scan for this product now on this QR code or take a picture. a screenshot if you want. But April and October in Western Montana, you can see these little caution signs. These are extremely important times a year for the desirable plant growth that we want. They're producing tillage, they're producing roots that are going to sustain them throughout the summer, grow lots more baby grasses, and survive through the winter. So I won't belabor that too much today, but you're going to see that this theme coming up over and over again. Not just the amount of pressure on the pasture, but also when that pasture gets grazed is critically important. Okay, Stephanie, your turn to come in. Thistle. Can you tell us a little bit about just what to look for if for Canadian thistle and how it differs from the bull thistle? I've got a vocab word here underlined. What does it mean to be rhizomatous?
Yes, it's a great question. And I can concur that everyone is very frustrated with Canada thistle, and it does tend to be a pasture nuisance. And that's because of that term you're learning today. So, Canada thistle has a rhizomatous root system versus a tap-rooted root, which is a carrot is a taproot. So, when you envision that, a rhizomatous is a root that's going to spread throughout the ground. And ironically, Canada thistle spreads more so via those rhizomatous roots than it does its seed source. And so that is why it's so highly competitive and difficult to control. Most all other thistles are going to be tap rooted, which makes them a lot more susceptible to cutting and digging and removing. Whereas cutting and digging and trying to remove Canada thistle actually encourages it to spur growth. So that's your first big insult of
I've
the
got
day.
a
Yes, and so this is a PDF that you guys can all scan and go to for Canada thistle that we produced at the Department of Ecology. And it's going to go over a little bit of identification characteristics, some timing, and some herbicide use that Lane will also refer to. But some basic identification, because when we think of thistles, our spines, the pricklies, and that's obviously a good go-to right off the bat. To differentiate between some of the other thistles and Canada thistles, the stem of Canada thistle is almost completely spineless. So the spines or the sharp parts are reserved for the leaves, and they're very spiny. So that is a good identification characteristic. Um, Something else to look for are that they have alternate leaves, and we call them lobed. So if you think of a leaf, it's the in and out are the lobes, but there's nothing regular about how the leaf lobes. That's obvious. So it's very irregular. And the leaf is going to be green on the top and the underside of that structure. A big difference also for Canada thistle versus a musk thistle or a bull thistle will be that the flowers are significantly smaller. On a Canada thistle, they still do have that purplish pink flower structure. But Canada thistle likes to cluster theirs on the top. And then another key characteristic that's similar to another weed you all probably know is spotted knapweed is that structure underneath that's supporting all the petals we call a bract. Those have a scale-like appearance, and they are also not sharp, ironically. So the big takeaway is the reason Canada thistle is so bad is that rhizomatous root system, and that is why it's very persistent and difficult to control, even with herbicides, because it has to translocate into that extensive root system. Some have said 70% of the plant is unseen by the eye because it's underground. So did you want me to share my screen with that, Natalie, or do we?
Sure. Actually, yeah, that'd be great.
I'm not sure how I do that.
And
More.
if you're having trouble using the QR code or don't have the capability, you can go to missoulaeduplace.org.
I, yeah, I typed that in the chat for everybody. And once you're there, if I can't seem to get this screen shared, I think I had to request it, Natalie.
Yeah, and I actually did.
Is at when you get to our website and you hover over what we do at the top bar, a list will pop up that says horticulture and agriculture, and then the second one is land management, and that'll pop out another little sidebar. And if you go to integrated weed management, within that page is a bunch of resources that you will find very useful with number one, just identification in general of noxious weeds. And then it will also give you a few of the what I would call nuisance or other invasive plant species that we tend to see show up around Missoula County. And then there's a resource tab with lots of different resources. And I do want to say in general is we are here to help you. It doesn't matter if you're a Missoula County resident or not. We understand that we're lucky to have the wide span of resources within our office. So reach out to us for email, but at the bottom or almost on all the pages, you're able to email and ask questions or even submit photos for identification if you can't get into the office. And so I just think it's really important that you know that identification is going to be the first step in understanding how to address any invasive or nuisance plant on your property because they're all very different, but yet the same, but they all take little tweaks to be most effective when treating them.
That's such a good point. Positive ID first. All right, Lane, let's see. How do we get rid or how do we even start thinking about controlling Canada thistle?
So yeah, like Stephanie was saying, it being a rhizomatous plant, really the best option for people to control this species is to use herbicide, something that's going to translocate into that root system and kill the plant. I've heard that some of those root systems can be 20 foot plus long under the ground, so you really want an herbicide that can translocate into those roots and kill the plant. One of the most common herbicides that we use is aminopyralid, or the trade name is Milestone. There's also many other herbicides out there. Picloram or Tordon is very commonly used, along with clopyralid products that usually have 2,4-D in them. That would be like a product like Curtail. But definitely want something that is going to translocate into those root systems and kill the plant. And as far as timing, best timing considerations is to be treating these things in the early rosette stage. So they'll be in that early rosette stage in the spring. And then again, usually later in the fall. So typically we recommend early spring and fall treatments. Usually when those plants are less than a foot tall is when you're going to get the best efficacy with your herbicides to manage those. And then, with some of these products, an aminopyralid has a pretty long residual in the soil. So that's going to extend for a good, 12 to 24 months in your soil. So being in mind of any grazing restrictions or hang restrictions. I don't know if any of you guys are producing, but there is grazing restrictions and hang restrictions on some of these herbicides. All of that is detailed in the herbicide label. So I do say that you become very familiar with your herbicide label of what you are using. And if you have questions, ask somebody like me. But those are the best chemicals to get rid of Canada thistle.
Awesome. And we do have some good questions popping up on the chat box. Um, I think I will take the first one. Hannah asked, does the Western Montana pasture calendar vary based on elevation? And yes, when you're way up there on the Continental Divide at 6,000 feet, you'll definitely be behind, probably about a month behind. Um, Thank you, Sydney, for sharing the pasture evaluation program link in the chat box for those of you who might have not been able to use the QR code. And for both of you, Stephanie and Lane, are there any options like goats habituated to eating Canada thistle? Can you use goats? Um,
I mean, I have not heard of any successful targeted grazing on Canada thistle, primarily because of the spines. I understand they can be trained to do it, but it's definitely in the research for what we do for integrated plant management. So, different strategies of controls. Grazing is typically not a recommended control method. That said, um, I'm not going to tell you what to try on your property, right? And so if that's something you want to give a shot to, you're not disturbing the soil, so you're not necessarily going to be spreading its root systems. You'll be, if they do target it, they're going to target the flowers, which I think is a sweet treat for a lot of grazers, and slow the photosynthesis process by less leaf mass. So it's worth a try if that's something you're looking into. I did read, I see that you have bees, and so I get it. I get why you don't want to use an herbicide. Um, just so you're essentially trying to deplete its ability to grow and prosper by defoliating or removing the above ground structure. But you'll never eliminate it completely in that with that method.
mhm. And as far as improving soil, I mean, yes, but when you improve the soil, you're also improving nutrient availability for the weeds as much as the desirable grasses. So, yes, overall, it's great land management to improve soil health through additional organic matter, not overgrazing, and some diversity. But this is what makes Canada thistle such a bugger, is it's going to thrive when you have more nutrients as well. And it can be very competitive. I have not found that I have Canada thistle in my pasture. It is not overgrazed, and and I mow twice a year. Mowing, grazing, pulling does not work for Canada thistle. I will say that. And so, unfortunately, and there's no biocontrol. And we will talk about biocontrol later on when we talk about leafy spurge, but there's just not a great option. So, unfortunately, kind of the takeaway here, and this was a hard lesson for me to learn, but spot treatments are your way to go. Hannah had a great question, and then we'll move on to case study number two. Um, Lane, do herbicides expire, assuming storage at room temperature, and how do we tell?
Yeah, so herbicides definitely can expire if left at room temperature. Typically, they say if it's an unopened container, you can at least get 2 to 5 years out of that product, and then it's going to start losing effectiveness. If it's a container that's already open, they say about 1 to 3 years is when you're going to start losing effectiveness. That also is dictated on how much light is in that area. If you're keeping it in a room temperature cold, or a dark room, you're not going to have any like light degradation with that product. But yes, they definitely can lose effectiveness over time, and you'll just see a decrease in effectiveness of that herbicide the longer you hold on to it, I guess.
And Clayton, your question perfectly segues into our case study number two. We're going to talk about persistence of herbicides in the soil and in horse manure. So, study number two is actually my property because I could not find a Horiolisum in any willing case study property. So, unfortunately, a small patch of Horiolisum was introduced to my 5 acre property from some hay. I just was starting to feel like I was running low. I was talking to a grower down in the Bitterroot, and so I bought some of their hay, and the place where I threw it all winter long started growing Horiolistum. So it's been there for a couple years now, unfortunately, because I too am adverse to um, using herbicides that are persistent in the soil. And Lane's going to talk, and Stephanie are going to talk about that a little bit more. But it's one of my major pasture goals is that a lot of the manure gets removed because I have 5 horses on 5 acres. And so I'm managing very intensively, which means I'm gathering tons and tons of manure into 2 large compost bins that I have. And my husband and I are composting it aggressively. So that means we're watering the compost pile, we're turning it regularly, we're monitoring its temperature. So when we do give it away to people, it is cool, it's free of, herbicides that are going to affect their gardens or their flower gardens, and we're able to remove this by the truckload and give it away. So it is really so up to this point, I've just been using 2,4-D, which doesn't have the same residual, um, you know, relatively safe for grazers, and I'm just spot treating. But I've been hand pulling this Horiolisum because it's been a very small patch, and I mow and pull and hoping that will over time. Um, over time will eradicate it, but I'm starting to think maybe I just do some more spot spraying and don't let the horses graze that area, which would be totally fine. This property is a bit different from the other, even though it's the same acreage, not too far away from each other in Missoula County. I manage and do rotational grazing on this property very aggressively. It is irrigated. I mow it twice a year. I fertilize it every year, and I treatment with 2,4-D. And you'll see on the map here, this back 2.7 acres, which I called the garden, I treat this pasture like most people treat their vegetable gardens. I protect it. I protect it from my horses mostly, from my horses overgrazing it, from my horses trampling, compacting, running around, tearing it up when the pastures are wet from spring rains or fall rains. They do not get to graze until this year. They did not graze this between all winter. We had such a mild winter. They did not graze it from January to almost mid-May, and I just started grazing it a month ago. I have sacrifice paddocks as well as a sacrifice pasture, a part of which I'm trying to rehab some of this because I realized my sacrifice space was a little too big and it was gathering more and more weeds all the time. So that could be something to consider is if you're seeing a lot of weeds in your sacrifice areas, your sacrifice zone could be too big because it means the horses are not controlling those weeds with enough disturbance. So the sizing of your sacrifice areas could be a way to think about controlling weeds long term in those heavily disturbed areas. So here's this grazing calculator again that we saw in pasture number 1. But this time, because it's fertilized, because you'll see the fencing, temporary fencing in the background there, it's heavily rotationally grazed. You see this grass here, and this is a few years ago, but my pasture still looks like this right now, where the grass is, at least 4 to 6 inches tall at all times. I don't let them graze down lower than 4 inches from ground to the top of the stem. So there's 2.7 acres of pasture here. And at 3 tons per acre, so remember the first case study was only 1 ton per acre because they were not using rotational grazing principles. With this, I have with 5 horses on this pasture, almost 1,400 grazing hours in the bank. Okay, again, that is with the amount of production and the number of animals out there eating, I've got 1,400 grazing hours to use through the grazing system, through the grazing season. If I continue to graze about 6 hours per day, which I'm doing right now, I've got 7.7 months of grazing, which is all I need to get me through, basically middle of May to end of September, after which the horses don't get to go on most of October, maybe into November, until we get freezing temperatures to solidify that pasture. They do not go on it when it is wet and in those really sensitive times of the year. At 10 hours per day, if I was to just turn them out for most of the day, I would only have 4.6 months of grazing in the bank. So back to the Horiolism. Stephanie, I mentioned that I was surprisingly kind of having a hard time finding Horiolism because there was a lot of misidentification. Every time somebody raised their hand and said they had it, it ended up being field pennycress. So can you talk to us a little bit about these different weeds and how to identify them, especially in the spring when they're just little baby plants? They're really hard to tell the difference.
So that's something to talk about is we all are, and you're all on a webinar about weeds and horse pastures, which leads me to believe that you're all very aware of your properties. And so you're very interested in making sure that you're successful. That said, seedlings are seedlings and they're very difficult to identify, typically, even for, experienced plant people. So when these things become susceptible to spread and invading more areas of your property are typically when they're seeding. So it's safe to say you can let these plants mature a bit. You don't want any of these. But at a seedling stage, it's tough to tell different plants apart. So letting these things grow a little bit, if you think it's maybe a beneficial plant, it's okay. Until they're flowering and seeding, you really have every opportunity to try to remove these. The only limitation you're going to have is the window of herbicide treatment. So some significant similarities. They're all mustards, which means they're all going to be four-petaled flowers. This is a Brassicaceae family. So all of them, four-petaled flowers. That doesn't help you very much. They're all white. That doesn't also help you very much. So what I can say also is there's slight differences when you really focus in on some of these things. So Horiolism, the one in the middle here, when you look at them in this picture, seems very obvious, a little bit more obvious, so that they're differences than perhaps when you only have one growing on your property. But the petals on the Horiolism, there are four petals, but they have a split down the middle of them, making it appear that they have 8 petals. So that is a key identification characteristic. Whereas Whitetop is going to be unnotched, and they're going to be appeared more flat-topped, clustered, more tightly clustered at the top, giving the name Whitetop. And then field pennycress is also going to be unnotched 4 petals, but they're not as dense and they don't form as tightly clustered white-topped appearances. Where do they grow? They love disturbed sites. This is one of their typical sites to establish. That said, Horiolism and field pennycress tend to do best or thrive well in dry, disturbed sites, whereas Whitetop really prefers places that have more moisture. And in Missoula County here, we notice that it really thrives in our more clay-based soils. So that's a little bit of the difference there. Their leaf structure also is quite different. The Whitetop has kind of a gray-green, blue-green appearance to it. And they kind of have an arrow-shaped leaf that clasps or it hugs the stem where it connects to the stem, whereas Horiolism does not clasp the stem, and it's more long and linear type of a leaf, and it has a smooth edge, so it doesn't have any of those teeth. Field pennycress, something that stands out from it is it's supposed to have a wider tip than it does at the base of the leaf where it attaches to the stem, but it does clasp or hug that stem the same as Whitetop. Field pennycress is mostly hairless, which differs from these other two weeds, and it's more of a, it starts greeny, but it turns a yellowish green leaf as it matures.
Mhm.
The root systems of these plants are the whitetop as a creeping perennial plant. So it has that rhizomatous root system, whereas Horiolisum has a slender tap root, and it's a short-lived or sometimes called a biennial um, plant that its primary reproduction is by seed, whereas whitetops is going to be the roots. And field pennycress is what we call a winter annual. So um, when we review what those terms mean, right? An annual means it completes its whole the plant's life cycle in 1 year, and if it doesn't seed, that's it. The biennial functions as it grows basal leaves first, and that means the leaves that are on the ground. Those are called basal leaves, and then it typically bolts and flowers on the second year, whereas a perennial returns each year and can flower and reproduce that way. Um, let's see. The
Those are some really
seeds.
good tap
Yeah,
root. That's really interesting that they have all three of them have such different life
but
cycles.
it's not visually very obvious, is the unfortunate thing. The most obvious part is they all have white clustered flowers. And they're all mustards. And so, yes, they are still going to be difficult to identify, but that seed stage really is quite obvious. White top,
Definitely. I've
yeah,
got the exclamation points next to the
mhm,
white top and the
mhm,
Horiolism because those are classified noxious weeds
yep,
by the state and the county where field pennycress is not. Can you
yes,
speak to that? Like, what does
I
that
can.
mean?
I'd love to. So, in the weed world, any unwanted plant we don't want is a nuisance plant or a weed. And so that flies out of the mouth quite easily. And it can be different for everybody, right? It's variable what we want and we don't want. Um, when we look at these three plants on the screen, they are all characterized invasive plants. And that typically means that they're a non native plant, meaning they aren't from our continent. And they have that potential to spread rapidly and they thrive in repeated disturbance. That's what gives them an invasive characteristic. When that becomes even more significant, we can move to a legal designation of a plant and it becomes a noxious weed. And all noxious weeds are invasive species, but not vice versa. But to be noxious can be as simple as sometimes it's toxicity, which we have with these plants, the two. They're toxic. They also impact agricultural yields. That's pretty huge. And that would help to place a plant on a noxious list. So, other characteristics are that they impact native plant habitat, wildlife habitat, and impact our recreation. But for the most part, what we're referring to today would be agricultural yield and toxicity. But they are one of our 36 listed state noxious weeds.
That is such good, helpful information. Thank you. And Lane, um, while folks pull up the Horiolism PDF, there is the sheets that you guys have on the integrated pest management website at missoulaeduplace.org are so great. I just love downloading those PDFs. They're so simple. They go through all the different methods and tell you right there if it's effective or not. And it gives you a laundry list of herbicides. Lane, we worked on a property together last year. It's actually my dog training grounds, and this like 20-acre pasture was so full of Canada thistle and other weeds that you could barely walk through. It was just really uncomfortable. And they sprayed an aminopyralid on it last fall, and today there are zero weeds out there. It was absolutely amazing how effective that herbicide was. That it was chaparral, so it had aminopyralid in it. Um, and wow, there's literally not a weed out there. But I am really loath to use those really effective herbicides because I want to give my manure away, and they can be very persistent in the soil. Um, especially when broadcasted, meaning they're sprayed, on the grass as well as the weeds, when those herbicides are used, when those herbicides are broadcasted, the horses are going to eat them. That chemical doesn't get broken down. It goes through the animal, gets deposited in their manure. If it then goes into my compost bin and then into a garden, it kills everything. And this is a huge problem gives horse manure a very bad name. So, what other practical solutions do we have for these weeds like white top, Horiolism? Um, what are some things that I could do?
Well, I will say herbicide is probably the best option, but next to herbicide, if it's a rhizomatous plant, you don't want to hand pull it. Like Stephanie was saying, the Horiolism is a tap-rooted species, so you can hand pull that. If you have large infestations, it's usually not practical, but you definitely can utilize that. And then, it's always important to try to increase competition on pasture sites. So letting those grasses grow longer, keeping your animals off of those sites for longer periods of time is going to help increase competition against those specific weeds, and help them not spread as quickly. And then, important caveat too is, you can pretty much use herbicide at any time with any of these species, but really the spring and fall treatment windows are your best time to kill those plants. You can definitely treat white top or Horiolism in full flower, and you're gonna get some control, but you're not gonna get the control that you would get in the spring or fall. And typically when you do an herbicide treatment, when a plant is in full flower, you're gonna at least decrease the seed viability of that plant, so by maybe half or something like that. So you can definitely use herbicide at any time, but definitely spring and fall treatments are the best, and it's because you're hitting those plants before they go to seed for the season, so there's no issue with them seeding out for the year.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I didn't say, but metsulfuron, as far as Horiolism and Whitetop are concerned, metsulfuron and chlorosulfuron are probably the two better products out there to do herbicide applications with. Again, you're targeting those spring and fall treatment windows. Chlorosulfuron has a little bit longer residual than your metsulfuron products do. So that chlorosulfuron product is going to stay in your soil longer. It's going to give you a longer residual than what a metsulfuron product will. You can obviously use 2,4-D, like Natalie does, or you could use a kill-all herbicide like Roundup as well that has no soil activity, doesn't bind to the soil particle, or it does bind to the soil particles very tightly. And so there's no issue with that moving to any trees nearby or anything like that. So, typically I recommend, if you have very small populations of white top or Horiolism, that you could utilize like a Roundup or a glyphosate treatment to kill those plants.
Wonderful. It looks like Clayton's beat me to the punch and answered quite a few herbicide questions already. Thanks, Clayton. That will keep us going. Let's see. Does anybody else have questions about white top, about Horiolism, field pennycress, grazing strategies?
I can tell you when we get calls about Horiolism and white top like showing up, it's almost a sure bet that they have purchased hay from somewhere off of their property, and that is the direct introduction to their sites. Would you not agree with that, Lane?
I would agree.
Yeah. And so those are when we get calls from our office of new infestations or people are curious, we almost can guess it that it was from purchased hay. So I just do want to reiterate any sort of plant materials that are brought onto your properties are probably your main vectors for the introduction of a lot of these species. And so it's always, and we have to trust people when we're purchasing hay from offsite, but it's good to know what those people had in their fields.
Actually, Stephanie, I'm glad you mentioned that because we forgot to talk about it. We talk just real briefly about the certified weed-free program that you and Lane coordinate.
I am not the coordinator of that, but I would ask that Lane do that. But
Oh, great.
yes, it is a wonderful program. Obviously, it costs more money, but you're protecting your livelihood and your grounds by utilizing um, certified weed free.
Yeah, Lane, will you just talk briefly about how you certify hayfields?
Yeah, so I run the certification program for all of our forage and gravel pits around the county. So that usually entails me going out to the property and doing a very systematic grid walk through the entire property, making sure that there's no weeds that are propagating. And then they have a certain amount of time, usually 7 days, to get that hay cut. And then they bail that up. And so, um, there's much less concern with weeds propagating in those types of forage than somebody who doesn't have certified weed seed free forage. And you are obviously going to pay more money to buy that certified feed, but it definitely is worth it if you're trying to eliminate the introduction of new weed species onto your property.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for that question, Hannah. All right. The next case study is also in Missoula County, and we're going to be focusing on leafy spurge. There are a few unique aspects of this property that make it a really great case study. The owner of this property I've been out to replace many times. It's lovely, it's vast, it's right next to the Clark Fork River, which is a big concern for the owner as far as spraying any sort of herbicides. And the pasture is dry land. So whereas the first two pastures we looked at were irrigated, this pasture is not irrigated. There's about 15 acres for 5 to 7 horses. And the last major concern for this owner is are metabolic issues. So this is a herd of a lot of Mustangs and a couple other breeds that are more predisposed to laminitis. And there's the owners are really fabulous about feeding them correctly, keeping their weight down, um, trying to back them away from the cliff that is laminitis. But that is a big concern for this owner, and I know a lot of horse owners out there. So just a quick orientation. The pasture, so they actually have a hay field out here that the horses do not graze, and that is irrigated. But the pasture in question is right in here where I'm circling with my marker. You can see it's wooded, so that's a little unique. A lot of these pine trees are going to make the soil a little more acidic, a little less favorable for the desirable grasses that we like. And again, it is dry land. It is not irrigated. And that is so important towards your land management goals and solutions because this pasture is so much more sensitive. And that's really the takeaway that I've learned and want you to take away is that when you have dry land pastures and especially dryland forested pastures, this isn't a great environment for the desirable grasses that we want, like the orchards and the bluegrass and the fescues and things that produce a lot that horses really like. When you have really sensitive pastures like that, you have to be even more conservative with your and more exacting with your pasture rotational grazing plan. So here's the grazing calculator. Again, if you want to scan that, download it, print it out, you're always welcome to give me a call or come into my office to help you fill it out. Or you can schedule a pasture evaluation site visit on that program website. So, real quickly, this is 15 acres for 7 horses. And again, being dry land and more forested, there's not a lot of production. So, we're going to assume 1 ton per acre, like the first example. With 7 horses, that means they're going to be grazing 8,295 pounds of grass per month. Just a tremendous amount that a horse can inhale day by day. It adds up quickly. So in the bank, this owner has 1,848 grazing hours, or about 7.5 months of grazing, if they let these horses out for 8 hours per day. At 12 hours per day, there's only 154 days of forage available, or 5 months. And if they do continuous grazing, which is something we have not talked about before, if you're just letting your horses out, um, not bringing them in, just unlimited grazing, you've only got about 2.5 months. So you can see how quickly your bank account gets dwindled down with continuous grazing. And what's even worse about continuous grazing is that horses, especially, are so hard on the desirable grasses. They stress them immensely. They go back to the same blade of grass, not just like a couple times a season, which is what grasses were evolved to do, but they will go back to the same blade of grass multiple times a day, which puts that desirable grass at such an immense disadvantage. I'm sure if you've had horses for 5 minutes, you all know that's that patch in the pasture that they go back to. And they could be, knee-high grass somewhere else, but they want to go back to the tender baby shoots of those desirable grasses multiple times a day. And that is where you're going to get your weed infestations. That is one of the most stressful things you can do to the desirable grasses that you want is allow them to be grazed on too many times per season. Okay. So, in order to start developing, one of the first things this landowner did in developing a land management or rotational grazing plan is they ended up early this spring having me out and renting our electric fence system. So last year we were given Data Mars gave us an entire set of step-in posts, various kinds of wire. We have multiple solar panels, solar chargers that folks can rent for 2 to 4 weeks out of the year, kind of depending on the demand and the season. But this owner rented our system so they could create some aisleways out to the various pasture locations. This one actually behind me in this picture goes out to a hay bale. So it was a strategic way to separate these horses, um, allow them easy access that mitigated labor and time. They didn't want to have to halter them and take them out to various pastures. So we created these aisleways with this temporary electric fencing and then block them from going out to the big pasture so that pasture could rest. This was in that critical April time of year when those grasses really needed time to produce tillers, which are their solar panels that are going to produce the energy and the biomass that they need to make it throughout the year. So this QR code on this page, again, takes you back to that pasture evaluation site. This is a very important website if you're on this webinar. There you can find the application. And once I've come out, done a site visit, we can consider the temporary fence, electric fence rental program. Something new to Missoula County for Missoula County residents for sure our priority, but we can rent it out to you Lake County or Valley folks as well. Okay, so Stephanie, one of the weeds found on this property is leafy spurge, a plant that I'm sure we're all very familiar with right now. It's the one turning all of the Missoula County hillsides bright green. Really, really difficult, noxious weed. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Absolutely. It, it is a very aggressive noxious weed, perennial noxious weed. And yes, Missoula's Unfortunately, our hillsides are blanketed with it. But I can say, as a 20 plus year participant in trying to reduce that amount, I have seen success. But I've been vested, and so it's difficult visually to see a change, but it's happening. This aggressive perennial can get 1 to 3 feet tall. It doesn't look very substantial for what it's doing out on the landscape and choking out desirable vegetation. But the most identifiable component of that plant that I'm pretty sure all of us are aware of is the milky sap or the latex that it produces when the plant is broken. And that's on all aspects of the plant. And so that's the most focused, identifiable characteristic. That said, the flowers and that color are pretty distinct. And the color that we're picking up on leafy spurge is actually that bract, the leaf-like structure that supports the flower. And they're like little heart-shaped bracts. And those are what we're seeing when we think it's in full flower. That said, that the flowers are very inconspicuous. You would have to look very close to identify the flower. So that's the coloring that we're seeing. The leaves are simple and they're smooth. They're very narrow and they're alternate on the stem. The roots are really where this packs the punch again too. Kind of a common theme really with the ones that are persistent and difficult to control is they have creeping type root systems. And for leafy spurge, that root system is capable of storing massive amounts of carbohydrates for it to be able to survive even in drought-like conditions. Even when it's being grazed or mowed, this extensive root system really has the ability to sustain itself by storing these carbohydrates. The root is also kind of unique in the fact that if you try to pull it up out of the ground, it distinctively will snap about ground level. But if you are lucky enough to get some out of the ground, you'll notice it's lined with these little pink nodes or shoot buds. And the characteristic of those is anytime this plant is broken or cut, is that it will spur new shoots to grow. And why control of this plant by hand pulling or mowing is not very effective.
Bummer.
I mean, if it wasn't an invasive plant, it'd have some really cool characteristics. It shoots its seed 15 feet, its root can reproduce new plants when you break it off. But unfortunately, it's an invasive noxious weed.
So here is the PDF. Again, it takes you back to the Missoula eduplace.org website to download the weed control PDF. Again, really, really a great resource for everybody. Something that's really unique to leafy spurge is that there is actually a biocontrol. And I wanted to take just a moment to talk about the Montana Biocontrol Program that's also housed right here at the Missoula County Department of Ecology and Extension. If you want to learn more about this biocontrol, we don't have time to talk about it here, but you can scan this QR code. It will take you to that Montana Biocontrol website. And at the top, the very first weed listed there is leafy spurge. So you can contact them. Melissa is our coworker that will answer questions about that and talk to you about the various species of biocontrol available and what you have to do. There's a lot of considerations to biocontrol that I, again, am learning at a rapid rate. It's really not as simple as just coming, grabbing some bugs and throwing them out. There's a lot of conditions that have to be discussed and optimized and considered before purchasing biocontrols. So definitely talk to Melissa and the folks at Montana Biocontrol Project before deciding on this. But goat grazing can actually be a part of a holistic land management plan on leafy spurge. So I really love the goat grazing businesses that are popping up all over Missoula and Ravalli County. So if you are interested in hiring somebody for goat grazing, call me, email me, and I'll send you some businesses that are doing a great job.
Can I preface that with that also? Grazing comes with stipulations also, and timing is very essential when utilizing grazing as a control method. So it's, you can graze too late and too early. So I just think that's, it's a good option with consideration and timing. So if you're going to pay somebody to do it, I want you to be doing it the right way.
Great. Lane, do you have anything to add? Any favorite weapons against leafy spurge?
So Tordon is very commonly used for leafy spurge treatments. That being said, that is a restricted use herbicide, so you have to be a licensed applicator in order to apply that herbicide. That's mainly the most common herbicide that's a restricted use herbicide. Most of our other herbicides that you can use are not restricted use. Um, Very common ones that we see a lot are like method or perspective that combines aminocyclopyrachlor with chlorosulfuron. Um, there's also some good treatments using plateau or imazapic. Um, Typically, those imazapic treatments are targeted at fall treatment windows before your first hard frost when those plants are pulling carbohydrates back down into the root system. Um, you get really good control with spring treatments as well with spurge, but I think fall treatments are actually the most beneficial in terms of using herbicide.
Interesting. So one of the most common themes today is timing. The right
Yes.
timing for grazing, right timing for herbicide control. Timing, timing, timing is everything. The last thing I'll say, as far as this case study, is grazing management as a way to mitigate the risk of laminitis in horses. This is definitely a specialty of mine, something I've been studying for decades. But the thing to remember, the thing to write down, the thing to highlight is that stressed grass is high carbohydrate grass, is high in non-structural carbohydrates. And stress can come from many things, but in horse pastures, it's mostly coming from overgrazing. So, allowing your desirable grass plants to grow up, to allow them to be over 4 inches tall, not to graze until they're 6 to 8 inches tall, letting them, having them watered, fertilized. Um, Happy plants are low stress plants, which means they will contain less non-structural carbohydrates at the tips where the horses are going to graze them. So, very complicated system. I can certainly talk to anybody more about that if they have in-depth questions, if they're managing metabolic horses. But stressed grass is high non-structural carbohydrate grass. So, don't let your grasses be stressed. Take care of them. All right. I don't see any more questions. So we're going to speed up a little bit here in case study number 4 and finish with number 5. We've covered a lot of the major themes that we wanted to get out today. So we'll speed up a little bit. We've got a 20-acre hay field in Tura, just a little east of Missoula, the city, and they have a absolutely horrible bulbous bluegrass invasion. Basically, the entire pasture, the entire 20-acre hay pasture is bulbous bluegrass. And I can confirm from our MSU Extension Specialist, Jane Mangold, from my personal experience, bulbous bluegrass is having a year. I have gotten so many calls and questions about this and seen it take over more than one hayfield and pasture this year. It is a noxious plant. It's an annual grass. On this pasture, there were some nuisance weeds like common yarrow, corn gromwell, and horsetail. Horsetail, which you certainly wouldn't want to bale up into hay because that can be toxic to horses as well. So again, be careful. This hay should not be fed, should not go off this property, basically. If you're baling up bulbous bluegrass and spreading it and feeding it to horses off property, you're doing disservice to the county you know, by baling this up and having horses spread it around. So, unfortunately, this field, um, well, I should back up and say that this field was dry land. So there is hope now for for the producer because as of this spring, the producer purchased this wheel system. So the bulbous bluegrass was has come in and invaded so aggressively for two major reasons. I think one, being a dry land, it was extremely sensitive. And the second is that they were grazing their horses, their string of outfitting horses on this property after the first cutting through those sensitive times in the fall and through the winter. So all the desirable grasses were heavily stressed, heavily disadvantaged, and allowed this bulbous bluegrass to just absolutely flourish. So the goals for this 20-acre hay field include increased hay production, because right now they're getting less than half a ton per acre. No way to make money on that or feed their horses through the winter. So unfortunately, this is probably an entire revegetation situation. And I wanted to show this example, and here's just a visual of the hay field here. It's right along the Clark Fork River as well. Unfortunately, this field is, which will be a huge advantage, probably needs to be completely killed off and reseeded. And this is a really extreme situation, but this does happen to hay fields. They have their own life cycle and they don't last forever. So this is just a really, really extreme situation of a very aggressive, invasive grass coming in, and there's really no other solution, I think, except to clear it out and start over. Stephanie, Lane, do you guys have any other suggestions for this grower?
I mean, the general theme is this has been extreme this year. It has the density is significant in Missoula County. I'm not sure if the above average precipitation has encouraged this. What I would say for starting over is my suggestions always is baby steps instead of doing the entire acreage would be to do it in parcels with kind of like how we do a containment, like containing a fire. So you can create boundaries of where it isn't instead of just wiping the whole slate clean. Lane, that's pretty conservative for me, and I'm not.
Yeah, I agree. I would not probably nuke the entire 20 acres in a single year. I would break that up into 2 or 3 years and maybe do, 5 to 10 acres each season and see what your results are. But definitely when you have this much invasive grass, I would say really, yeah, your only option is to pretty much nuke that thing with, like a glyphosate product, something that's a kill-all herbicide, and then come back in and try to do a fall dormancy replanting in those areas when you're getting good spring moisture. Or sorry, fall moisture, not spring.
I did want to give a shout out to our neighbors down the hallway, Missoula Conservation District. They do rent a no-till drill to the public. So if you come into the office, if you're looking to replant, re-veg a pasture or a hayfield, that is an option. There is a deposit fee, but you get that back if the equipment is returned. So really, really cool opportunity and resource for Missoula County. Okay.
I also think bulbous is unique and not in a good way for us in the fact that it doesn't seed; it makes literal little clones of itself as what we think of as a seed head, and it's creating those little bulblets, which look like miniature little onions, and they're just instantly new grasses ready to grow and spread. And so, I mean, it's kind of unique, but scary for us. I did read, I thought this was kind of also unique, is that rodents and birds utilize the bulbs because has high starch. So I was like, maybe they're the problem.
Mm, the birds are spreading it everywhere.
Maybe.
So here is one last picture of this hayfield. That's all bulbous bluegrass. It's so sad. So sad. All right. And we're at our last case study number 5. I wanted to put in a boarding facility because these guys have very different pasture land management goals. And this one does in particular. This is out in Clinton, Montana. You guys, a lot of you have probably passed it right off the highway. What's unique about this property is I actually did not find any noxious weeds, but there was a bouquet of nuisance weeds. There's a 27 plus-ish pasture, but lots of horses grazed on it, a dozen at a time, and continuously throughout the year. There's no rotational grazing plan. But, these owners are they have to respond to the unique needs of their clients. Each animal that comes in is priority. And so, unlike my pasture where I can be really picky about when I turn my horses out and I have 100% control, I think it's so important to understand that we all have very different goals for our property and be understanding and give folks grace where, sometimes the horses are the priority. And people don't have the time, the labor, the finances to rehab entire, large acreage. It's just enormously expensive to do so. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars. So I thought this was an interesting opportunity just to talk about different land management goals, while also talking about how to kill weeds. Stephanie, will you talk to us about compacted soils? That's something that we hear a lot about in soil health, and I'm not sure a lot of people know what that means.
Well, I mean, the words kind of tell you it's tightly drawn to the ground and not favorable growing conditions, compacted soils. What does successfully grow in compacted soils and will break your soils up are weeds. So when we're thinking of just like a lawn setting, compacted soils and just a Kentucky bluegrass lawn would be the introduction and spread of something like a dandelion. It's able to grow in compacted soil. It can, make your soils less compact, but it's not a desirable plant. And so in pastures with compacted soils, we're going to see the dominant species being nuisance or invasive plants because it's really the only thing that can grow in those conditions. If you're lucky enough to have grasses, and your soils are compacted or compromised, when animals eat them, typically they're able to rip those plants' roots from the ground. And so it's just one of the main, and then opening up for other invasive species to grow. And so compacted soils really are, you would think nothing would want to grow there, but most typically your undesirable, even your taprooted plants are what are going to come in and be able to grow in those conditions.
And we're going to see these along the fence lines.
Yep,
You do here in this top picture, around the gates, around the waters, around, the haystacks. And that's going to be a major source point for weed introduction.
absolutely. Hmm. And just how it works, plants succession happens. So we disturb the soil, something's going to grow. So it's always best to consider pushing it in the direction we want it to go versus letting nature take course because again, typically if we don't push it towards what we want, something undesirable is going to grow there.
Okay. So I was going to mention, I think what is priority on this property is the black henbane and the buttercup because they have toxic properties. And Ashley asked a question about why are they not noxious? Well, noxious, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, noxious weeds have a very specific label. They are noxious as like it's like a It's not a certification, Stephanie. What would be
It's a
the,
legal designation. And so,
okay. Yeah,
but I can
legal.
also address that. Some counties, so we have a statewide list of these 36 species, but each individual county and each land managing organization can designate plants noxious. So there are various counties that black henbane will be on a noxious weed list, or it will be on our city open space noxious weed list. And so in some areas, this probably is a listed noxious weed because everyone has the ability to make that designation as a land managing agency. And in Missoula County, it is not. We do have it on our watch list. And it's really been watched this year. This is another one that I think the spring moisture, and it's a biennial plant. So that means this stuff was there last year that's flowering, but we've had a banner year for black henbane, unfortunately. And so it is toxic and it's an irritant, even touching and pulling it. But eliminating that seed source spread is going to be key for this year to better anticipate less of it the next growing cycle and in 2 years.
Yeah,
You said
I think I read that. Sorry, I think I read that they have like 500,000 seeds per
Yeah.
plant. So really getting on top of making sure that those plants don't flower and do not go to seed. I think they're typically viable, 2 to 4 weeks after they're flowering. So making sure that you're at least going out there and trying to hand pull them. If you're not getting the whole taproot, they can come back. But at least you're controlling the seed source coming from those plants.
great. And that brings us back to that timing of herbicides again, right, Lane?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, typically, like anything else, your early spring and fall treatments are going to give your best control on these species. And I think the curly dock in particular has a very, very long, I think it's like an 80-year soil, can live in the soil seed bank. So
Oh dear.
making sure that that does not go to seed is very important if you want to control that species, or if it's a species that's on your property. If you realize that, yeah, that one plant can have viable seed in the soil for 80 plus years, you really want to be controlling those types of species and making sure that they cannot go to seed.
And where we're seeing it are honestly in disturbed soil. So what's happening is that seed viability is being awakened and they're growing because we're cutting in trails, we're cutting in roads, and either revegetation hasn't happened or it wasn't successful. And so these plants, this is where we're seeing a majority of the black henbane this year.
Interesting. We've kind of touched on this very briefly a couple times, Stephanie, but will you speak to the necessity to put desirable things in where we're taking undesirable things out?
Absolutely. A lot of times when we do weed control, we're thinking of it as, we're going to, whatever mechanism we choose to do, mow, spray, pull, is that's going to be successful and that weed is no longer going to exist. But the reason it is there is because that niche wasn't filled in the first place and a plant took advantage of it and grew there. And so that plant's probably been there more than 1 year, dropping seeds and growing. And so when we go to remove it, we need to consider that a form of disturbance. And we all know disturbance is going to be, increase our undesirable plants. And so revegetation is something we really need to consider anytime we do a weed treatment, unless we have substantial density of thriving plants or desirable plants. And this is a type of weed management is, putting in plants that can compete and hopefully outcompete these invasive plants. And so it is a financial consideration, but it is totally a necessary one. And again, here's our timing thing again. You don't want to waste your money on buying seed and have it not be successful. So there are pretty significant timing requirements for seeding, and those are not going to be during hot, dry months. And so late fall seeding is a great time, or very early spring seeding, but trying to get something established where you have done a treatment is going to benefit you in the long run with your weed management. And I agree with the chat that Westland is a great source and resource for seed specific to your sites out of Ronan.
Yeah, I'll triple Westland seed.
Mm-hmm.
There is going to forget more about seeds than I'm ever going to learn. But I also want to give a shout out to CHS out they they uh they closed down their location on North Reserve, but they did move out to past the airport on Highway 10 there, and they're a great supporter of our programs. They've helped a lot with our grazing conferences and our temporary fence rental systems. So I really want to give a shout out to them too. They have great knowledge there. They have seed, they have herbicides, and the people to talk to. Great. All right. Well, that was our last case study. So, what we have left to do today is just go through a Rolodex of resources available to you. This is your last opportunity here to scan the pasture evaluation program code. This will take you to the main website where you can sign up for a site visit through the application. You can find the pasture calendar download. You can find the grazing calculator download, and so much more. So please take advantage of this. This is a great time of year. We're kind of getting into the heat of summer where the soils get really difficult to sample. So if you want a soil test to understand, what might be limiting in your pastures, if you should consider a fertilizer or not, get on that ASAP because that soil gets compacted and I stop doing them in basically in July. So sign up now. If you are interested in developing a rotational grazing system, this is my passion. If you haven't figured that out yet in this webinar, I consider my rotational grazing on my property to be a part-time job, and I'm really passionate about it. Would love to talk to people who are interested in, the timing, how to design your property, identifying good stuff, bad stuff, how to move those animals around most to be labor efficient. Those are things I love talking about. And here are some apps. We've mentioned a few of them, like the MSU Extension Mont Guides, our Missoula County Weed District sheets that we've had some QR codes available for. And then some apps that we really like in this building include the Montana Grasses app. This is a free download produced by Montana State University. And then Seek by iNaturalist is one that I use a lot. It's also free and pretty reliable. Not good on grasses. Not great on grasses, but for flowering stuff, it's pretty reliable. So I pull up the Montana Grasses app when I'm trying to ID those. We also have a Facebook group page for those of you also interested in learning more about improved pastures. If you have animals on them, please join our Missoula County Pasture Proud program. I post stuff there infrequently, but when I do, it's good information coming down from our office or Montana State University. And then finally, another pasture of my very passionate topic is track system rotational grazing. And we are hosting a farm tour and a storytelling event. This will be our second year in a row. Last year was absolutely fantastic, but we're doing it down in the Bitterroot this year in Stevensville. There's about a 7-acre property there, and she's developed a great track system. This is a big topic in the horse world right now. Would love for people to come see, have dinner, tell stories, bond over our love for horses and land. You can scan that QR code on the bottom right to register for that event. It's September 4th, so coming up in a couple months. And with that, MSU is really, really big into surveys. If you guys have 5 more minutes, I know it's literally 1:30 right now, so we're out of time. But if you have just 5 minutes, I would so appreciate scanning this code, doing the survey, telling us what you think about this presentation, if you want more, if you want different topics, how all of our wonderful speakers did. I'll also be emailing this to everyone in a follow-up email. That will also include the recording for this, so stay tuned. And I appreciate everyone. Most of you stayed till the very end, so we must not have been half bad, Stephanie. Let's see, we'll take any final questions and wrap things up. Okay, Steph, thanks for sharing that.
I will say too, with herbicide treatments, it's never a one and done. Like you're always gonna have to do more treatments. If you can do a spring and a fall treatment, as long as your rates allow that, great. You should try to do that. But most of these weed species, it's going to be a multiple year process, and you're going to have to be managing them each year. It's not going to be a, oh, I treated it once and it's all gone and I don't have to worry about it anymore. Um, and importance of calibration is also important. If you are not calibrating your equipment, you're doing it wrong, and so you need to properly calibrate that equipment, whether it be with a boom sprayer or a backpack. That stuff needs to be calibrated so you're getting the correct mixing ratios with your herbicides. Otherwise, you're just not going to get the effectiveness or the efficacy that you want to get.
What a perfect message to end with, Lane. Nice. The message being this is a long-term battle with weeds, never a one and done. Develop a land management plan. We've got so many great resources here in our building. Missoula County Department of Ecology and Extension. Look us up. And thank you again for joining. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Natalie.